The stars had always been kind to the Volanthi people in their world of Sereth. Prime had known nothing but peace for 10,000 years under the gentle light of their pale blue sun. They were beings of grace and beauty with tall, slender bodies that seemed almost fragile, and skin that glowed with soft bioluminescence in shades of silver and pale gold. The Volanthi had never built weapons, and they had never trained soldiers, and they had never known the horror of war because their corner of the galaxy had always been quiet and safe. Elder Saurus, within light, stood at the great window of the council chamber and watched the sky with eyes that had seen 300 years of peaceful sunrises, but today those ancient eyes held only fear. The Kethrani had come. Their ships filled the darkness between stars like a swarm of metal insects, and each vessel bristled with weapons that the Volanthi could not name because they had no words for such things. The Kethrani dominion was known throughout the galaxy as a force of conquest and destruction, and they moved from system to system, taking everything of value and leaving only ashes and slaves behind. The Msaurus turned to face the other elders, who sat in their chairs of woven light, and every face showed the same expression of hopeless terror. "We cannot fight them," said Elder Mira. Speak softly, and her voice trembled like wind through crystal chimes. "We have no ships of war, and no soldiers, and no weapons." "Then we must flee," said another elder named Keth Dreams Deep. "We must take what we can carry and abandon our world. There is nowhere to flee," Saurus replied, and the weight of truth made the words heavy. "The Kethrani are faster than us, and they will hunt us across the stars until every last Volanthi is dead or in chains." Silence fell over the chamber, and it was the silence of a people facing extinction then. Young Coordinator Veth Shines Bright spoke from her place near the door, and her voice carried a desperate hope. "The beacon," she said. "The ancient emergency beacon that connects to the Galactic Compact Defense Network." The elders looked at each other with uncertainty, because the beacon had never been used in all the long history of their people. "The Compact will not help us," said Myra. Speak softly. "We are too far from their core worlds and too close to Kethrani space, and no species will risk war with the Dominion for our sake." "But we must try," Veth insisted. "What other choice do we have?" Saurus closed his eyes and felt the weight of 10,000 years of peaceful civilization pressing down upon his shoulders, and he knew that Veth was right. "Activate the beacon," he commanded. Deep beneath the council chamber, in a vault that had not been open for generations, the ancient machine hummed to life and sent its cry for help racing outward through the void at the speed of light. The message was simple, and it was desperate, and it said only this: "We are the Volanthi of Sereth Prime, and we are dying, and we beg any who hear this to help us." The signal spread across the galaxy like ripples in a pond, and it reached the ears of many species. The Terrani received the message, and they checked their star charts and calculated the risks. And they sent back their regrets because the Volanthi were too far away and the Kethrani were too dangerous. The Melith received the message, and they discussed it in their parliament for many hours, and they decided that intervention would be unwise because their own borders needed protection. The Sithani received the message, and they simply deleted it because they wanted no trouble with the Dominion. One by one, the great powers of the Galactic Compact heard the cry of the dying Volanthi, and one by one they turned away. But the beacon did not care about politics or borders, and it continued to spread outward into regions of space that were not part of the Compact at all. It reached a small yellow sun on the outer edge of the galaxy, and it reached a heavy, brutal world that orbited third from that sun. It reached Earth. Commander Yellen Vasquez of the United Earth Defense Fleet sat in her command chair aboard the battleship Indomitable, and she read the translated distress signal on her screen with dark eyes that had seen too many battles. She was a woman of 40 years with short gray hair and scars on her face and hands, and a reputation for being the most stubborn officer in the fleet. "What do we know about these Volanthi?" she asked her first officer, Lieutenant Commander Chun Chun. pulled up the information on her console and frowned at what she found. Peaceful species, sir, and completely non-violent, and they have no military capability at all, and their world has standard gravity of only 0.6 Earth normal, and the Kethrani conquerors, sir, and they have taken over 80 systems in the last century, and they are responsible for the extinction of at least 3 species and the enslavement of dozens more. Vasquez looked around her bridge at the faces of her crew, and she saw the same thing in every set of eyes. They were already checking weapon systems and calculating jump coordinates and preparing for battle. These were humans, and they were children of a world that had tried to kill them every single day since the first cell divided in the primordial oceans, and they had survived ice ages and supervolcanoes and asteroid impacts and plagues and wars beyond counting. They were Deathworlders, and they did not know how to ignore a cry for help. How long until we can reach Sarath Prime? Vasquez asked. 14 days at maximum burn, sir. And how long until the Kethrani fleet arrives? Approximately 16 days, sir, based on their current trajectory. Vasquez nodded slowly, and a cold smile crossed her scarred face. Then we have 2 days to spare, she said. Signal the rest of the task force and tell them to form up on our position. Sir, Chun said carefully. Command has not authorized this mission, and the Volanthi are not members of any alliance, and we have no treaty obligation to help them. I know, Vasquez replied. The Kethrani fleet numbers over 300 vessels, sir, and we have only 12 ships. I know that too. Chun was quiet for a moment, and then she smiled the same cold smile as her commander. Setting course for Sarath Prime, sir. Best possible speed, Lieutenant Commander. The engines of the Indomitable roared to life, and the ship leaped forward into the darkness between stars, and behind it came 11 more vessels carrying 2,000 human soldiers who had heard a stranger cry for help and had decided that was reason enough to fight 14. Days later, Elder Saurus within light stood at his window and watched new ships enter orbit around his world, and for a moment he thought the Kethrani had arrived early, but these ships were different, and they flew no flag of the Dominion, and when his communications officer reported that a vessel was hailing them, Saurus felt something he had not felt in days. He felt hope. This is Commander Yellen Vasquez of the United Earth Defense Fleet, the voice said through the speakers. We received your distress call, and we are here to help. Saurus looked up at the brutal angular shapes hanging in his sky, and he whispered a prayer of thanks to whatever gods were listening. Help had arrived. The human shuttle descended through the pale clouds of Sarath Prime, and Elder Saurus within light watched it come with a mixture of hope and growing unease. The vessel was nothing like Volanthi craft, which were smooth and elegant and built for beauty. As much as function, this thing was a brutal box of metal with scorch marks on its hull and weapons mounted on every surface, and it looked more like something the Kethrani would build than a rescue ship. Perhaps we have made a mistake, whispered Elder Mira speaks softly as she stood beside Saurus in the landing field. Perhaps these humans are no better than the Dominion. They answered our call, Saurus replied, though his voice held doubt. That must count for something. The shuttle touched down with a heavy thud that shook the ground, and the landing ramp lowered with a hiss of escaping air, and then the humans emerged. Saurus felt his heart stop. They were monsters, not in appearance, for they looked almost Volanthi in basic shape, with 2 arms and 2 legs and a single head, but everything else about them was wrong. They were massive creatures standing nearly a full head taller than even the tallest Volanthi, and their bodies were thick with dense muscle that bulged beneath their armor. They moved with a strange fluid grace that reminded Saurus of the hunting beasts that stalked the deep forests, and their eyes swept the landing field with a predator's attention, tracking every movement. Each human carried weapons that looked far too heavy for any Volanthi to lift, and they wore armor that could have been carved from solid stone. The leader removed her helmet, and Saurus saw a face marked with scars and eyes that held the cold confidence of someone who had faced death. "Many times in one, Elder Saurus within light," she said, and her voice was deeper than any Volante voice. "I am Commander Yellen Vasquez, and we are here as we promised." Saurus stepped forward on legs that trembled, and he hoped the human did not notice his fear. "We thank you for coming, Commander Vasquez," he said. "We did not expect anyone to answer our call." "We heard you," Vasquez replied simply. That was enough. She breathed in the thin Volante air without any sign of difficulty, and Saurus noticed that none of the humans wore breathing equipment, even though the atmosphere of Sarath Prime had much less oxygen than most species required. "Is the air not difficult for you?" he asked. Vasquez shrugged her massive shoulders, and the gesture looked almost dismissive. "It is only 60% of what we prefer, but we have trained in worse conditions and we will manage." A medical officer, a tall human with dark skin and gentle eyes, stepped forward and scanned the gathered Volante with a small device. "They are quite fragile, Commander," he reported. "Bone density is approximately 40% of human standard, and muscle mass is minimal, and their cardiovascular systems are not designed for sustained stress." The humans exchanged glances that Saurus could not read, and he felt a flush of shame at being called fragile, even though he knew it was true. "We have never needed to be strong," he said quietly. "Our world has always been kind to us." Vasquez nodded slowly, and something that might have been sympathy crossed her scarred face. "Then, you have been fortunate, Elder," she said. "Our world was never kind." She gestured to her tactical officer, Lieutenant Chun, who pulled out a small projector and created an image in the air. "This is Earth," Chun said, "our homeworld." Saurus looked at the blue and green sphere and saw nothing unusual at first, but then Chun began to explain. "Our world has gravity nearly twice as strong as yours," she said. "The atmosphere contains many elements that are toxic to most species, and the weather patterns include storms that can destroy cities, and the temperature varies from extremes that can freeze blood to extremes that can boil water." The image changed to show great waves crashing against shores, and mountains spewing fire into the sky, and vast plains of ice that covered entire continents. "Our oceans contain creatures with thousands of teeth," Chung continued. "Our land is home to predators that can run faster than any vehicle, and our smallest insects carry diseases that have killed millions of our people." "Your world," Saurus whispered in horror. "It sounds like a death trap." "We call it a death world," Vasquez said, and there was strange pride in her voice. "And we are Deathworlders born and bred." Chung showed more images now, and these were even more disturbing. Humans climbing frozen mountains with no visible purpose except to reach the top. Humans diving into crushing ocean depths where the pressure would kill any Volante instantly. Humans hunting massive predators with primitive weapons for sport. "You do these things willingly?" Myra Speaks softly asked, and her voice was barely audible. "For recreation," Chun confirmed with a small smile. "We find it relaxing." Saurus felt dizzy, and he reached out to steady himself against a nearby column. The humans were not just strong, and they were not just dangerous, and they were something far more terrifying than that. They were a species that had been forged in the fires of a world that wanted them dead, and they had not merely survived, but thrived and grown to love the challenge. "How did you not destroy yourselves?" Saurus asked, with such strength and such aggression. Vasquez was quiet for a moment, and her eyes grew distant, as if she was remembering something painful. "We nearly did," she admitted, "many times and in many ways, but we always found a way to pull back from the edge, and we learned to turn our aggression outward, against a universe that tried to kill us instead of against each other." "And now you turn it against the Kathrani," Saurus said. "Yes, but there are only 12 of your ships against hundreds of theirs." Vasquez smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression, and Saurus understood in that moment that this human had faced worse odds before. The Kethrani have numbers, she said, but they have never fought Deathworlders, and they do not understand what that means. What does it mean? Myra speaks, softly asked Lieutenant. Chan answered, and her voice held. The weight of 100,000 years of human history. It means we do not know how to quit, she said. Our ancestors survived ice ages by eating each other, and we survived plagues that killed half our population, and we survived wars that burned our cities to ash, and every single time we got back up and kept going. The Kethrani think war is a tool, Vasquez added. They use it to get what they want, and when the cost becomes too high, they stop. She leaned closer to Saurus, and her dark eyes burned with something ancient and fierce. But for us, war is not a tool, she said. War is what we are, and we have been fighting since before we could walk upright, and we will keep fighting until every enemy is defeated. Or we all dead. Saurus looked at this terrifying creature who had come across the stars to help strangers, and he understood something important. The universe had sent the Volanthi, a monster to fight a monster, and for the first time since the Kethrani appeared in his Sky, Saurus believed that his people might actually survive. What do you need from us, Commander? He asked. Vasquez straightened, and her voice became businesslike. We need maps of your world, and we need information about your population centers, and we need volunteers who can help with medical aid and evacuations. You will have everything, Saurus promised. Good, Vasquez said, because the Kethrani will be here in 2 days, and we have a lot of work to do before they arrive. She turned and began issuing orders to her soldiers, and Saurus watched them move with terrifying efficiency, and he thought about what it meant to be born on a world that wanted you. That perhaps he decided such a birth was not a curse, but a gift, because it created beings who would travel across the galaxy to answer the call of strangers. It created humans. The humans worked without stopping, and the Volanthi watched them with growing amazement, and Fiercerus within light had never seen anything like it in all his 300 years of life. The soldiers moved through the streets of the capital city, carrying equipment that should have required machines to lift, and they built fortifications with their bare hands, and they dug trenches and set up weapon emplacements and transformed the beautiful, peaceful city into a fortress. They worked for 20 hours at a time without rest, and when one shift ended, another began immediately, and the progress never stopped. How do they do this? Coordinator Vess Shines Bright asked as she stood beside Saurus, watching a group of humans carry massive metal plates up a hillside. They've not slept since they arrived. I do not know, Saurus admitted. Their bodies should have collapsed by now. A human sergeant named Kowalski overheard their conversation and walked over with a steaming cup in his hand. He was an older man with gray in his short hair and scars on his thick arms, and he had the easy confidence of someone who had done this kind of work many times before. Coffee, he said, holding up the cup. This is our secret weapon. What is coffee? Veth asked. Kowalski grinned and handed her the cup, and she sniffed at the dark liquid inside. It is a drink made from beans that grow on our world, he explained. It contains a chemical that keeps us alert and focused. Veth passed the cup to their medical expert, who scanned it with a device, and his eyes widened. This liquid contains a neurotoxin, the expert said. It would kill a Volanthi in minutes. Kowalski laughed and took the cup back and drank deeply. It just makes us work harder, he said. Humans are built different, as you have probably noticed. He walked away, still chuckling, and the Volanthi stared after him in disbelief. They drink poison for energy. Veth whispered, What kind of beings are these? Saurus had no answer inside the command center that the humans had established in the council. Chamber Commander Vasquez stood before a holographic display of the planet, and she pointed to various locations as she spoke to her. Officers, the Kethrani will likely strike here. And here first, she said, indicating 2 major cities. They prefer to target population centers to break morale. We should evacuate those areas. Lieutenant Chen suggested. No. Vasquez replied. If we evacuate, they will simply move to the next target. And then the next, and we cannot evacuate the entire planet. Then, what do you suggest, Commander? Vasquez smiled her cold smile, and it was the expression of a predator planning a hunt. We let them land, she said. We let them commit their ground forces. And then we destroy them. That will cost lives, Commander, said Major Torres, who led the ground forces, human lives and Volante lives. Yes, it will. Vasquez agreed, and her voice was heavy with the weight of that truth. But it is the only way to win, and the Kathrani do not expect anyone to stand and fight. And that will be their mistake. Sora stepped forward, and the humans turned to look at him. You speak of death so easily, he said. Your own people and mine. Vasquez nodded, and her dark eyes held something that might have been sadness. We do not speak of it easily, Elder, she said. We speak of it because we must, and because pretending death will not come does not prevent it. She gestured to a chair, and Sora sat, and Vasquez sat across from him. On Earth, she said, we learned long ago that some fights cannot be won without sacrifice, and the question is not whether people will die, but whether their deaths will matter. How can death matter? Soros asked. Death is simply the end. No, Vasquez said firmly. Death is only the end if the story stops there. And we do not let the story stop. And when a human soldier falls, we pick up their weapon and we keep fighting, and their death becomes part of our victory. She leaned forward and her voice grew softer. I cannot promise you that no Volante will die, she said. But I can promise you that every human here will give their life to protect your people. And that is not an empty promise. Soros looked into her scarred face, and he saw the truth there. These strange, terrifying beings had come to die for strangers, and they accepted that fate without hesitation. Why? He asked. Why would you do this for people you do not know? Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was distant. Because someone has to, she said. Because the universe is full of darkness and cruelty, and if those who can fight do not stand against it, then the darkness wins. She smiled, and this time it was a real smile. Warm and human. And because we know what it is to be afraid, she added. We know what it is to face something terrible alone, and we decided a long time ago that we would never let others feel that way if we could prevent it. In another part of the city, Sergeant Kowalski was training a group of young Volante volunteers. They could not fight because their bodies were too fragile and their instincts too peaceful, but they could help in other ways. This is a bandage, Kowalski said, holding up a roll of white material. When a human is wounded, you wrap this around the wound and press hard, and do not let go. How hard? Asked a young Volante named Saris. Dreamed like Kowalski took her delicate hand and placed it against his forearm. As hard as you can, he said. You cannot hurt us, and if you press too lightly, we will bleed to death. Saris looked at her thin fingers against the human's thick arm, and she could feel the dense muscle beneath his skin, and she understood that these beings were made of different stuff than her people. We will try, she promised. That is all I ask, Kowalski said. Humans are hard to kill, but we are not invincible, and when we fall, we need someone to help. US get back up. He looked around at the gathered volunteers, and his weathered face grew serious. We are going to bleed for your world, he said. We are going to fight and suffer, and some of us are going to die, and we accept that, but we need you to help us keep going. The Volante looked at each other, and something passed between them, and it was something new. It was courage. We will not let you fall alone, Sari said, and her voice was stronger than before. Kowalski smiled, and for a moment, he did not look like a terrifying warrior from a death world. He looked like a tired old soldier who was grateful for the help. Good, he said. Now let me show you how to splint a broken bone. That night, as the final preparations were being completed, Sora stood on the roof of the council chamber. and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Kethrani fleet was approaching, and tomorrow, or the next day, the fighting would begin. Commander Vasquez appeared beside him, and she too looked up at the darkness. "Are you afraid?" Saurus asked. "Yes," Vasquez admitted without hesitation. "Only fools feel no fear before battle. But you will fight anyway." "Fear and courage are not opposites, Elder," Vasquez said. "Courage is being afraid and doing what must be done anyway." She turned to face him, and her expression was serious. "Tomorrow the Kethrani will learn what it means to fight. Deathworlders," she said. "They will learn that we do not surrender, and we do not retreat, and we do not stop. And if you lose," Vasquez smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had already made peace with death, "then we will make them pay for every inch of ground," she said. "And they will remember this world for the rest of their existence. And they will tell their children to never attack a planet protected by humans." She put her hand on his shoulder, and the weight of it was immense, but somehow reassuring. "Rest now, Elder," she said. "Tomorrow the war begins." Saurus looked at this strange, brave woman who had crossed the stars to die for his people, and he felt something he had not felt since the Kethrani first appeared. He felt hope. The Kethrani fleet arrived at dawn, and their ships filled the sky like a swarm of angry insects, blocking out the pale blue sun of Sareth. Prime Supreme Commander Vextor stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Dominator, and he looked down at the small world beneath him with contempt. "How many defenders?" he asked his tactical officer. 12 vessels of unknown design, Supreme Commander, and approximately 2,000 ground troops." Vextor made a sound of amusement, and his mandibles clicked together in the Kethrani expression of mockery. 12 against 300, he said. "These fools have come to die." "They do not appear to be." "Volanthi, sir, and our records indicate the ships are from a species called humans, from a world called Earth." "I have never heard of them," Vextor said dismissively. "They must be some minor species seeking to play hero, and they will learn the cost of their foolishness." He gave the order, and the Kethrani fleet began its advance on the bridge of the indomitable Commander Vasquez watched the enemy approach, and her expression was calm. "All ships report ready, Commander." Lieutenant Chen said. "We are outnumbered 25 to 1. "I can count, Lieutenant." Vasquez replied. "Launch all fighters and prepare for close engagement." "Close engagement, sir." Vasquez smiled her cold predator smile. "The Kethrani expect us to run or hold position and defend, and they do not expect us to attack." The human fleet surged forward, and the sudden aggressive movement threw the Kethrani formation into chaos. Vextor stared at his display in disbelief as the tiny enemy force charged directly at his armada. "What are they doing?" he demanded. "This is suicide." His tactical officer had no answer. The human ships tore into the Kethrani fleet like wolves among sheep, and they moved with a speed and aggression that the Dominion had never encountered. Explosions bloomed across the darkness as human weapons found their targets, and Kethrani vessels died in balls of fire. "Return fire!" Vextor screamed. "Destroy them!" The Kethrani ships answered with devastating volleys, but the human vessels were already moving, weaving through the enemy formation and striking from unexpected angles. The Indomitable took a direct hit that killed 30 crew members and tore a hole in her side, but she kept fighting. "Damage report," Vasquez demanded. "Hull breach on decks 7 through 9 and weapon systems at 60% and engines still operational." "Then we can still fight," Vasquez said. "Bring us around for another pass." In the space above Sareth Prime, the battle raged for hours, and the humans fought with a ferocity that the Kethrani had never seen. They lost ships, but for every human vessel destroyed they took 20 Kethrani with them. Vextor watched his fleet shrink, and he felt something he had not felt in decades of conquest. He felt doubt. "Sir," his officer reported, "the human ground forces have engaged our landing troops." "Show me." The display shifted to show the surface of Sareth Prime, and what Vextor saw there made his blood run cold. The human soldiers had emerged from positions that his scanners had marked as uninhabitable. They came out of toxic waste zones where the air was poison. They came out of high radiation areas where any sane creature would die in minutes. They came out of valleys where the gravity was crushing, even by normal standards, and they came fighting. Vextor watched footage of human soldiers advancing through a storm of plasma fire, and they did not stop when they were hit. One human took 3 bolts to the chest, and he fell. And Vextor thought he was dead, but then the human started crawling. He crawled 200 meters across open ground with his guts hanging out of his body, and he crawled all the way to a Kethrani walker, and he detonated an explosive charge that destroyed the machine. What are these creatures? Vextor whispered. His science officer pulled up the data, and his voice shook as he read it. They are from a high-gravity world, sir, and their bones are 4 times denser than ours, and their muscles are incredibly efficient, and they can survive wounds that would kill any other species instantly. Are they on combat drugs? No, sir, and this appears to be their natural state on the surface, Sergeant. Kowalski led his squad through the burning streets of the capital city, and they moved from cover to cover, taking out Kethrani soldiers with brutal efficiency. A young Volanti volunteer named Saris Dreams Light ran beside them carrying a medical kit, and she watched the humans fight with terrified awe. Kethrani soldier appeared from a doorway and fired at Kowalski, and the plasma bolt hit him in the shoulder and spun him around. He did not fall. He turned back and shot the Kethrani twice in the head, and then he kept moving. Sergeant, Saris cried, "You are wounded." "It is just my shoulder," Kowalski said through gritted teeth. "I have another one, and we need to keep moving." They pushed forward, and behind them more humans fell, but the advance did not stop in orbit. The battle reached its climax as the Indomitable faced down 3 Kethrani carriers alone. Commander Vasquez stood on her damaged bridge, and she looked at the enemy ships filling her view screen. "They are launching boarding parties," Commander Chan reported. "Let them come," Vasquez said. "All hands prepare for close quarters combat." The Kethrani warriors stormed aboard the human ship, expecting easy prey, and they found something else entirely. They found humans. The corridors of the Indomitable became a slaughterhouse as human soldiers fought hand to hand with the invaders, and the Kethrani, who had conquered 100 species, discovered that they had never faced anything like this. Humans fought with knives and fists and teeth, and they did not stop when they were wounded, and they did not surrender when they were outnumbered. One human marine killed 6 Kethrani warriors with a broken chair leg before he finally fell. Another held a corridor alone for 20 minutes with nothing but a pistol and her bare hands. The Kethrani boarding parties were destroyed to the last soldier, but the Indomitable was dying and her engines were failing, and Commander Vasquez knew that this was the end. She looked at her display, and she saw a Kethrani carrier moving toward the planet, preparing to bombard a civilian shelter where thousands of Volanthi were hiding. "Helm," she said quietly. "Set collision course for that carrier," Commander Chun said. And her voice cracked. "It has been an honor serving with you, Lieutenant," Vasquez said. "Now get to the escape pods and take command of what remains of the fleet." Chun hesitated and tears ran down her face, but she was a soldier and she understood. "Yes, Commander," she said. "The honor was mine." The crew evacuated and Commander Yellen Vasquez sat alone on the bridge of the Indomitable, and she guided her broken ship toward the enemy carrier. "This is for every species you have ever destroyed," she whispered. "This is for every world you have burned, and every person you have enslaved." The Indomitable struck the carrier amidships, and both ships died in a ball of fire that lit up the sky above. Sereth Prime on the ground, the Volanthi looked up, and they saw the explosion, and young Saris Dreams Light knew somehow that the human commander had given her life to save them. Battle continued for 3 more days. and the humans lost 4 ships and 2,000 soldiers, but they did not break Lieutenant. Chun took command and she sent a message to the Kethrani fleet. "We can do this forever," she said. "Can you, Supreme Commander?" Vextor looked at his shattered fleet, and he looked at the humans who were still fighting despite everything, and he understood. Something terrible. These creatures did not fight like any species he had ever encountered. They did not count costs, and they did not calculate odds, and they did not stop. They simply fought until they won or they died, and there was no middle ground. Had lost over 100 ships and 10,000 soldiers, and the humans had lost only a fraction of that, and they showed no sign of weakening. "Retreat," he ordered. "All ships retreat." The Kethrani fled, and they did not stop until 3 star systems separated them from the Deathworlders and on Sereth Prime. The humans stood in the ashes of victory, and they mourned their dead, and they knew that they had won. The sun rose over Sereth Prime, and for the first time in weeks, there were no enemy. Ships in the sky. Elder Saurus within light stood in the ruins of the capital city, and he watched the human soldiers gather in the central square, and he felt tears running down his face. They had won, the Kethrani had fled, and the Volanthi people still lived, and it was all because of these strange, terrifying, wonderful beings who had come from across the galaxy to fight for strangers. But the cost had been terrible. 4 human ships destroyed and 2,000 soldiers dead, and their commander, Yelena Vasquez, had given her life to save a shelter full of Volanthi children. Lieutenant Chun, now Commander Chun, stood before the assembled soldiers, and her face was pale with exhaustion and grief. "We lost many friends," she said. "We lost brothers and sisters, and we lost our commander who led us with courage and wisdom." The humans bowed their heads, and some of them wept openly, and Sora saw that these warriors who had fought like demons were also capable of deep feeling. But they did not die in vain. Chun continued. "They died for something that mattered, and they died protecting people who could not protect themselves. And that is the best death any soldier can hope for." She lifted her head, and her voice grew stronger. "We will remember them, and we will honor them, and we will make sure that their sacrifice was not wasted." "Hoorah!" the soldiers shouted as one, and the sound echoed off the broken buildings like thunder. The Volanthi had no traditions for honoring warriors because they had never had warriors before, and they had never needed such traditions. But now they needed one coordinator. Veth Shines Bright had worked through the night with the Council of Luminance, and they had created something new, a song of light. The Volanthi gathered in the square alongside the humans, and they began to sing, and as they sang their bioluminescent skin shifted colors and patterns of incredible beauty. The song told the story of beings from a distant death world who had heard a cry for help and had answered it without hesitation. It told of soldiers who fought against impossible odds and never gave up. It told of a commander who gave her life for children. She would never meet. The light patterns washed over the gathered humans, and the colors shifted to match their visual perception, so they could see the beauty that the Volanthi were creating for them. Some of the soldiers broke down completely and strong. Men and women who had faced plasma fire without flinching wept like children. It was the most beautiful thing any of them had ever seen. When the song ended, Saurus stepped forward, and he stood before Commander Chun, and he bowed low in the Volanthi gesture of deepest respect. "You have saved my people," he said. "You have bled for us and died for us, and we can never repay this debt." Chun shook her head, and she wiped the tears from her face. "There is no debt, Elder," she said. "You asked for help, and we answered, and that is all." "But why?" Saurus asked, and it was the same question he had asked Vasquez days ago. "Why would you do this for people you do not know?" Chun was quiet for a long moment, and she looked up at the sky where Commander Vasquez had made her final sacrifice. "Because we understand," she said finally. "We understand what it is to face something terrible alone, and we understand what it is to feel helpless against forces beyond your control." She turned to look at the gathered Volanti, and her voice grew soft. For most of our history we had no one to help us, she said. When the Ice Ages came and killed most of our ancestors, there was no one to save us, and we had to save ourselves. When the plague swept across our world, and millions died, there was no one to cure us, and we had to find our own cures. When we went to war with each other and burned our own cities, there was no one to stop us, and we had to learn to stop ourselves. She smiled, and it was a sad smile, but also a proud one. We survived all of that alone, she said, and we decided that we would never let anyone else feel that kind of loneliness if we could prevent it. Saurus looked at this remarkable woman, and he understood something important about humans. They had been forged in suffering, and they had emerged not hardened and cruel, but compassionate and brave. Their harsh world had taught them the value of help because they had so rarely received it themselves. We have a word for what you have shown us, Saurus said. In your language, it would translate as resolve. Resolve, Chum repeated. Yes, and it means the determination to keep going no matter what and to never give up even when everything seems hopeless. She nodded slowly. That is a good word. We will teach it to our children, Saurus promised. We will tell them the story of the humans who came from a death world to save us, and we will teach them that resolve is the greatest gift anyone can give. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy began to change. The Galactic Compact received reports about what had happened at Sarath Prime, and species that had ignored humanity for centuries suddenly wanted to talk. Torani sent diplomats, and the Melith offered trade agreements. And even the reclusive Sathani expressed interest in establishing relations. But more importantly, the Kethrani Dominion changed its behavior. Supreme Commander Vextor had returned to his homeworld in disgrace, and he had been forced to explain to the Dominion Council how he had lost 100 ships to 12 enemy vessels. Council had not been pleased, but they had listened carefully to his account of the battle, and they had watched the footage of humans fighting through wounds that should have killed them. They had seen the recording of Commander Vasquez ramming her ship into a carrier to save enemy civilians, and they had been afraid. For the first time in their long history of conquest, the Kethrani were afraid. New orders went out to all Dominion fleets, and new maps were drawn with large sections of space marked in red. The marking said avoid, and they said Deathworlder Protectorate, and they said do not engage under any circumstance if the humans did not return to Earth. Immediately, they stayed on Sarath Prime for several months, helping to rebuild and training Volanthi volunteers in the basics of defense. Sergeant Kowalski, who had fought through the entire battle with a hole in his shoulder, taught emergency medicine and basic tactics to eager young Volanthi. You may never need this, he told them, but it is better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. Young Sari's dreamed light, who had run alongside the soldiers during the battle, became the first Volanthi to complete human combat training. She would never be a warrior in the way that humans were warriors, but she could help, and that was enough. On the day the humans finally departed, the entire population of the capital city came out to see them. Officers stood at the front of the crowd, and he watched the soldiers board their shuttles, and he raised his hand in farewell. Commander Chun paused at the ramp of her shuttle, and she turned back to look at the gathered Volanthi. If you ever need us again, she called out, you know how to reach us. We will not forget, Saurus called back. We will never forget. The shuttles rose into the sky, and the human ships broke orbit and jumped away toward distant Earth. Saurus watched until the last ship vanished, and then he turned to address his people. We have learned something today, he said. We have learned that the universe is not always kind, and that there are those who would destroy us without mercy. The crowd was silent, and they listened with the attention of people who had nearly died and knew it. But we have also learned something else, Saurus continued. We have learned that even in the darkest times, there are those who will stand against the darkness. He looked up at the sky where the human ships had disappeared. They came from a world that tried to kill them every day of their existence, he said. And instead of becoming cruel and hard, they became protectors. They answered our call not because they had to, and not because they would gain anything from it, but simply because we asked. That is what resolve means, and that is what we must remember. We must remember that help exists even when we cannot see it. We must remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And we must remember that one day we may be the ones who answer someone else's call for help. The crowd began to glow as they sang, and the light song rose into the sky, and it carried a single word in every frequency: resolve, and far across the galaxy, in the halls of the Kathrani Dominion and in the councils of the Galactic Compact, and on 100 different worlds, the story of Sareth Prime was told and retold. It was the story of a peaceful people who faced extinction and cried out for help, and of the Deathworlders who answered with resolve. The end.